Hi, I'm Aaron Marcus, and welcome back to the Acting and Modeling Success Summit. And I'm really happy. I've got an old friend, a director, Arnon Shorr, not an old director, but a director who cast me and directed me in one of his projects. His name is Arnon Shorr, and he is the founding filmmaker for Ox Rock Productions. And he's recently shot actually A Modest Suggestion not that long ago. That was the film that I was in with him, which was a really amazing experience. Arnon has directed and produced award-winning short films for nearly 2 decades, and he recently relocated from the East Coast to Southern California. So Arnon, thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thank you. Really appreciate it.
So here's what I wanted to ask you about. A lot of times, people throw around the term producer. I'm a producer of this. You hear about different types of producers. I was hoping maybe you could shed some light as to what a producer does or what producers do.
I can certainly try to. A producer for movies is typically the person who's responsible for shepherding a project from the point where the ideas start to coalesce to the audience, whether it's in a theater or on a DVD or online. Now, I wish I had this in front of me, but the Producers Guild in recent years has started to define the role of the producer and of all those other producing credits, executive producer, co-producer, associate producer, all of those, because the definition has been very loose and very hard to pin down for many years.
Yeah, because I know, or actually, maybe you can either confirm this or shed some light on it. I thought, for instance, an executive producer quite often is somebody who is more involved with finances, of making sure that, there is funding for the project.
Finances and, to a certain extent, packaging. Sometimes you can get an executive producer if you negotiated the literary rights for a project, for example. So if there's a book out there and you bought the movie rights from the author and you have those and control those and bring those to the table, in some cases that can count as an executive producer as well. On the independent film side of things, where budgets are lower and where money typically comes from individual sources, executive producers are often directly the sources of the funding. So rather than with larger films where the executive producers are the packagers, the people who have the connections and who are pulling all the different sources together from banks and financing entities and all that sort of stuff. The executive producers on those films are typically working that way.
Okay, so let's say if somebody says, okay, I want to be a producer. I want to get involved in producing, let's say, independent films. What would you recommend that they begin to do?
I think there are a few important components. I don't want to call them steps exactly because they don't have to happen sequentially. They can happen all at the same time. If you're starting out and you've never produced anything and you want to produce an independent film, you need to have at least some understanding of how independent films get made and how they're structured, not just in terms of the technicalities of how to shoot a movie, but also in terms of the business side and the legal side and logistics and administration and all of that. So I think these components to getting to a point where you can produce your own film involve working on other people's movies, and that's in whatever capacity you can. Work on other people's movies, get to know the people who are producing, and learn as much as you can from their process.
And just to interrupt for just 1 second, would you recommend, now there are titles called PAs, production assistants, And I mean, basically, they are some of the hardest working people on the set and get paid the least. They're doing everything from if there are extras on a set, they're, signing them in, they're helping extras cross, they're grabbing things for people. Would that be a good initial step for people to at least find themselves on a set?
I think to be a PA is a very, very good opportunity to learn. I've been discovering out here in California, if you're a PA on a big Hollywood production, that's a job in itself. That's a career in and of itself, or it can be a career in and of itself. So um, there's definitely a lot to be learned. I think there's an important distinction between set PAs, who are the production assistants who are on the set, who are bringing the actors water, who are schlepping things here and there, and office PAs, who are the ones shuffling paperwork and collating and making photocopies and doing all of that. I think when it comes to producing, you might learn more from being an office PA than from being a set PA. Because if you think about it, you take a typical independent film that can afford maybe 2 or 3, or if they're lucky, 4 weeks of production. That's 4 weeks, but the producers are working on this thing for usually 1 to 2 years. And most of that work happens not on set, but in the production office and around that. So if you can become an office PA, if you can become a producer's assistant and help out with all of those other processes that happen before and after production, you'll probably learn a lot more about producing than you would on set.
I mean, that's a great point. So I guess the question would be, how do you even find out about an independent film, and then how would you go about applying to, be an assistant to the producer?
I think in LA it's kind of a different environment. There are lots and lots and lots of opportunities for networking out here. Lots of opportunities if you're keeping your ears to the pulse of the city, of the industry. There are always productions starting up, and if you are eager to learn, eager to work, and if you're able to volunteer or work for very, very cheap, there are usually a lot of opportunities for that kind of work. Outside of LA, you have to be a little bit more diligent, especially in places like where I have lived, like in Baltimore and in Boston. There aren't as many feature films being made. Even independent films, there aren't as many. So you really have to keep your finger on the pulse of the local industry, get to know who's making movies, and stay in touch with them.
I
And
guess,
go
oh, I'm
ahead.
sorry, I was just going to say maybe organizations like Women in Film and Video might be a good place to, network and meet with people. Maybe there are some meetup groups, I
Absolutely,
guess.
absolutely. And the networking is important, not as a once in a while kind of a thing, but as a regular part of your routine, because it's not enough. Um, it's not enough to meet people. You want to stay on their radar so that when they're gearing up for their next project, they have you in mind. So groups like Women in Film, which tend to meet regularly, at least in the cities where I've been a part of it, or other networking groups that meet. I'm part of a group up here that meets weekly, which is a little bit much, especially because they meet about 40 miles from where I live, so it's a little hard to get to. But that group, the people who go there weekly, they work constantly with each other because they're always on people's minds when people are thinking, gee, I need somebody for this or somebody for that. They're right there. They're accessible. So definitely the idea is make yourself accessible, make yourself available, keep an eye out for new productions that are starting up, and be there when they're hiring and when they're looking for help.
I just thought, especially in some smaller markets, maybe contacting the film commissions in, in your particular community, and you might find out that there is a production coming to town. And it could be an independent film or it could be a feature film. And once
The
again,
film commissions, yeah, the film commissions are good for are better for the larger productions. So if you want to help out in the local production office of a bigger film that's coming to town, the film commissions are definitely a good place to find out about those before anyone else does. Um, and with the big films, when they do come to town, they do typically rent out office space and open up an office, and typically do need office assistants to help keep things going and to help run things.
so okay, so let's say you've done that and you've made a connection, you've spent some time working as an assistant in the actual office, and you're seeing the numbers, you're seeing, the paperwork, you're seeing how that stuff works. So what would be a logical next step once you feel, pretty comfortable with having, an idea of how things are run? What, and maybe not necessarily next, but what are some of the other things that you would
Right.
recommend somebody do?
So the second thing that's very important, I think, for somebody who's interested in producing, is you have to go out and you have to produce. Um, and like I said, these aren't necessarily steps, these are components. They can happen simultaneously. You work at a production office during the week, you produce a short film on weekends or evenings. It doesn't have to be anything big, it doesn't have to be anything elaborate. Um, if it's very basic and very small and involves very few people, that's often the best way to start out and to get a sense of what the different components are. And whatever you're doing, always try to do it as professionally as you can. Just because it's small doesn't mean that you should not do all the paperwork and not do all the planning and not cross the T's and dot the I's the way you might on a larger project because you're
Because
building skills.
and something you just mentioned that it kind of made me think about this. That's interesting is that maybe you can find somebody could find a student film. At a local college, there are film classes. People are going to have to go out and shoot a film, whether it's for a class or maybe just independently. And if you can be involved in producing, even if it's a student film that's not, probably going to go anywhere beyond the classroom, but if you, do an incredible job, not only would it give you great experience doing it on your own, but who knows where that student might go to next.
Right.
And you just produced their movie, and then all of a sudden, 6 months later or a year later, this person's really doing some interesting things. You did a great job producing. Well, why wouldn't they bring you on, to continue to produce with them?
I think there's a lot to that. And as much as I feel networking is very important, I prefer to meet people in practical situations, in practical working situations, because that's when you really get a measure of a person's commitment to the work and work ethic and dedication um, and attitude also. It's one thing to shake somebody's hand at a mixer and to be told, hey, I'm a really great producer. I mean, that's really great. You wear a nice suit, that's good. But to actually see a person at work doing the things that they say they can do um, really gives a much clearer impression. And
I guess
I tend to hire people and work with people who I've worked with before much more than I hire people or work with people um, who I shake hands with at a networking event.
well, and the two things that you just kind of brought up, I mean, one would be somebody could have the greatest credentials in the world. Maybe they've done great things, but until you start working with them and find out how they react in tough situations, when all of a sudden there are deadlines, things are happening, there are budget issues, you want to make sure that this is somebody that you can completely trust. And you're never going to know that
Right.
until you actually experience it. And the other thing that you said too, as far as continuing to work with the same people. I mean, I know other directors as well who hire the same actors over and over again. And I know some actors are not very happy about that because they feel like they really can't get in with that person. But I completely get it. you know, if I were a director and I had a great experience with an actor, somebody I know can deliver, somebody who shows up on time and they do the work, they're listening and they do a great, a great job, why wouldn't I want to hire them again?
Absolutely. So the third component that goes into this preparation for producing um, involves starting with the end in mind. If you're interested in producing, it's very important for you to think about and to try to articulate what it is, what your purpose is when it comes to producing. What is your ultimate goal? Are you producing because you want to produce romantic comedies? Are you producing because eventually you want to produce, big budget action films? Are you producing because you're passionate about small, gritty, independent dramas? Are you producing because you have another alternative career in mind that producing might enable? Are you producing because you eventually want to produce stuff to create projects that you can act in or that you can direct? If you have those goals clearly in mind and clearly articulated, then at every step along the way, you can make sure that the work that you're doing serves those goals. So if you are going for PA positions to try to learn the ropes, and let's say you're interested in gritty independent dramas, you're not going to be a PA on the next $300 million Marvel action film. You're better off looking to PA and maybe a David O. Russell film. I mean, those are not quite so gritty; they're kind of big budget relatively, but if you, that'll give you an opportunity to learn producing of the kinds of movies that you might want to make. If you're interested in producing so that eventually you might produce something that you could act in, and so that you could, instead of waiting for other people to give you a career, you could create one for yourself. Produce shorts that you act in. Make sure that the stuff that you are creating gives you opportunities to do the work that you want to do as well. And always move towards that very specific and very particular end goal as much as you can, as much as is reasonable. So those are really the three components that I think are very important before you dive into your own feature.
And I was just going to say, so it almost sounds like by following your ideas, there might be times where you turn down certain projects simply because you really don't feel that it's taking you into your ultimate goal. And it might be preventing you from getting to where you really want to go. And I can tell you, I mean, sometimes it might be a hard decision, especially if somebody's willing to pay you, a pretty good amount of money to do, to work on something. And it's, in some ways it's almost like doing extra work. I mean, there are actors that will do extra work every day if they can get it, and you can kind of get seduced, and not that you're going to make a fortune doing that, but people can make a living, working every day as a union extra. And if your ultimate goal is to act in projects, then you're never going to head there
It's a
and get
tough
there.
calculus. It's a very tough calculus because money's important. As much as we, the artist inside me thinks that money shouldn't be. The practical side of me is very aware of that, and that has to be a part of the consideration because money, ultimately, whatever your goals are, you have to be alive and you have to have a roof over your head. You have to be eating. And in many cases, in order to reach those goals, you have to have at least some money to spend in order to, if you're acting, money for headshots and whatnot. If you're directing, money to put together demos or shorts or whatnot. So if you need money and a job comes along that doesn't exactly move you towards your goal in terms of the aesthetic components of it or the content, but it'll mean you'll have another month when this project is done when you don't have to worry about how to pay the bills, and you can spend that month working on your own project, or spend that month volunteering for something that you really care about that's really going to help. That's you're paying towards that same goal. I think if you have money set aside and you don't need the extra cash, and a project comes along that isn't really that doesn't move you towards your goal, then it's a good time to sort of take a step back and look at it and say, hey, maybe my time would be better spent if I focused a little bit more on what I want to do, rather than you know making a few
Right. I
extra
mean,
bucks.
and certainly I wasn't even suggesting that, you just turn down things that, aren't take. I just meant that you don't want to continuously take on projects that are taking you further away. And sometimes you just have to find a balance
Yeah,
of, like you were saying, you take on this job and then that will give you a month or two, leeway to try to search for other things as well. But absolutely. Look, we're artists, but we also need to pay our bills. And it's not fun when you don't have any money. You
right.
know, you can be the greatest artist in the world, but it's tough to create art when you're freezing and you don't have food and things like that. Hey, listen, I know we're going to have to wind things up because there
Oh
are
wow,
a number
already.
of actually, yep, there are a number of questions that have come in. I want to make sure that I get to these as well. So, hey, this came in from Terry in New York. As someone who wants to produce films, how do I find great scripts?
That's a tough one. That's a tough one. Um, Here in Hollywood, at the big agencies and the big studios, they have armies of underpaid people whose job it is to read scripts and to basically make recommendations to their bosses, whether their bosses should read the scripts or not. Most of their scripts they don't recommend to their bosses. Then their bosses read a whole bunch of scripts, and most of those they don't recommend. And so eventually, what trickles through this system are, at least in theory, the best of the best scripts. They're not always the best in terms of the art of it, because Hollywood is very much a business. So some of them are better as financial vehicles. But um, by the time one movie gets made, thousands of scripts have been passed on. So if you're an independent filmmaker, to a certain extent, you also face this challenge of going through thousands of scripts before you find the right project for you. And that can take a tremendous amount of time, and you can't necessarily hire other people to do the reading for you. Um, Part of what might help, two things might help. One might be to try to narrow down as much as possible what interests you, and to put out calls for scripts in that vein. And you can be very specific. If you're looking for a heartfelt, low budget story about a boy and an alien, you know, you might put that out there. I don't know that you'll get ET2, but you'll get something a little bit more specific. People aren't necessarily going to send you, um, a mindless action film with lots of explosions.
Now, where do
Uh,
you where do you put that out to? I mean, who would you even begin to contact for something like that?
um, I've seen people do it online. I've seen people put that out on Craigslist, things like that. If you're on IMDb, the IMDb message boards have things like this. If you want to be a little bit more targeted, you might consider joining inktip.com. Inktip.com is I think it's probably the most active website of this kind. There are others, but this is probably the most active. Um, the two kinds of people who join Inktip are producers or writers. Writers join Inktip to basically put their scripts out there in a searchable database. And producers join Inktip in order to find scripts. And their search algorithms can be very specific. So you can specify male lead or female lead. You can specify single single central character or ensemble. You can specify big budget, small budget. You can specify genre, subgenre, um, location, lots and lots of different things, and then keywords on top of that you can search for. So if you're a producer looking for a script and you go to Inktip, inktip.com, you can probably get some very targeted results to your search that might help narrow down your options pretty considerably.
Oh, that's a great idea.
So Yeah,
Great. I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question here. Oh, this
sure.
is Grant from London. You wanted to know, how do I go about finding investors, and do I offer them percentage of the profits? And if so, how much?
I'm going to hide now. Um, okay, so the investor thing, and this gets even more complex because Grant is in London. So I'm beginning to get familiar with securities law in the U.S. I have no idea what it's like in other countries. Um, Basically, when you're raising money for a film, as soon as you start to offer somebody a share, a part of the success or failure of a business, you're offering a security, and you have to comply with securities law. And that's where things get really, really
Wow.
messy and complicated. So yes, so I would say, depending on how much money you're trying to raise, and depending on how well you know these investors, I mean, if they're people who are willing to offer you money and aren't expecting anything in return, that's great. Then go make your movie. But if they want to see a share of profits, which is very standard, then you probably have to find an attorney who can guide you through the process of doing all the proper filings and all the proper paperwork and doing it legally. In the U.S., if you don't do that and things go sour, it's securities fraud, and you can end up in jail, and it's really messy. So,
So
and that's been
find an
from
entertainment attorney to handle that kind of stuff for you.
well, I mean, in the U.S., you find an entertainment attorney who refers you to a securities attorney.
Oh,
On one recent film I was working on, we had two securities attorneys and one entertainment attorney, just so we could start asking people for money. So yeah, it's kind of, and goes back to what we were saying earlier about how sometimes you need to have some money in the bank, and for something like this in the U.S., if you're making if you're making a $200,000 film, which is an ultra low budget film, you still typically have to spend five, ten, $15,000 in order to start raising the money, in order to start trying to get investors. Um, Sometimes you can be lucky, and you don't have to go through that if you happen to know somebody already who says, yeah, let's do this, and then all the paperwork is a formality.
well, there's
But
also,
that's rare.
I was just going to say, there's also, it was a Kickstart where you can put a project online on Kickstart.com, and you're not offering percentages. People are just donating, or hopefully they're donating to your project. And
Kickstarter,
a
Kickstarter,
Kickstarter.
and Indiegogo, and all those crowdfunding platforms are very, very interesting. It's very hard to raise a lot of money on those, but if you are smart about it and careful about it and meticulous about it, you can certainly raise enough to get started. And there are resources on the web all over the place, uh, especially from people who've done it successfully, uh, with advice and suggestions on how to do it. There's one man I know. His name is Mark Zickrey. He is one of the people behind a very, very famous now Kickstarter project called Space Command. They set out to raise $75,000 for a science fiction feature film, and when the campaign ended 2 months later, they had almost $250,000 in the bank.
Wow. Hey,
So
Arnott,
he has a lot of good stories to tell and a lot of good advice.
that's incredible. Listen, I know I've got to wind this up right now. I do want to
Sure.
ask, if people would like to get in touch with you, what is the best way to do that?
Um, I am easy to find all over the web. I try to make a point of that. So you can always try my website, which is woefully underdeveloped, unfortunately, which is oxrockproductions.com. That's OXROCK Productions. But you can also find me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is at Shorr. That's SHORR. You can find me on Facebook. You can find me on LinkedIn. I mean, chances are, if you Google me, you'll find my email address in one of those first three or four search results.
Fantastic.
So I should be pretty easy to find. I'm happy to
Great.
answer questions.
Arnon, thank you so much. And by the way, just on a side note, you directed Modest Suggestion. You were wonderful to work with, and I hope we get a chance to work together again. And
I
thank
hope
you
so too.
so much for being a part of this. It was great.
Well, I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Arnon.
Take
Bye
care.
bye.